This is the number 70 grit spreading truck issued around 1966. According to its owner, it spent the greater part of its life underground, having been buried around the 70s and then dug up several years ago. The owner stated that it had been buried in a metal lunchbox with several other items. He contacted me to restore it, and given the story, how could I refuse? I must say that it's one of the more interesting castings I've come across. The surface is just strange to feel. The underlying metal has oxidized and has blended with the paint, so in a way it feels like the entire casting is covered with some sort of cancerous growth. The wheels are completely rusted to the axles, which themselves have almost rusted away. On the front of the base, the steel of the bent axle has been touching the metal of the base, causing it to act like a sort of sacrificial anode, as parts of it have corroded away. When taking the model apart, I decided to play it safe and just remove the mushroom post, as I was not familiar with the casting's internal structure. I'll drill out the post later when I know what I'm working with. The grit spreading truck has a really neat feature to add play value. It has a hole in the bed and a small piece of plastic between the two halves of the casting. You could fill the back up with sand and then pull the plastic, allowing the sand to escape the bed and then be distributed along the ground. On this model, the plastic is still here, but the end has been broken off, so that's something I'll need to look into later. Pulling the windshield out, I was amazed that it was not cracked. This is probably due to it being buried inside of a box. If it had been buried by itself, odds are the compacting of the ground would have eventually crushed the plastic. The first thing I'll need to do is remove the wheels and axles from the base. I'll just use a pair of modified wire cutters to snip the axles in the middle and then pull them out. I was worried that I might have issues getting the back axle out as it goes through the metal of the base, which has a much tighter tolerance than the front. When iron or steel rusts, it grows in size and mass. This is why the wheels are not moving, and why I thought the axle might be stuck in the base, but luckily I was able to entice it to come free. Since the axles are rusted to the wheels, and I'm sure I would break a wheel trying to get them out, I'll take the long way around and drop the assemblies into some hydrochloric acid. The acid won't harm the plastic of the wheels, but it will slowly eat away at the axles and rust. I will just set this outside for a day or two and let it do its thing. I'll check in on it from time to time. Next, I need to look at removing this old paint. This ended up being quite an undertaking, as the paint, as I mentioned before, has integrated with all the oxides. So normal means of paint removal are not working as they should. To fix this, I need to remove the oxidation, but since there's a lot of paint and dirt stuck in the oxides, I don't want to ruin my electropolishing setup. So I decided to add water to the acid I have the wheels in, and then drop both parts in for a few seconds to remove all that oxidation. Dropping them in, you get the feeling that they'll dissolve in seconds given the reaction, but this is due to the acid attacking the oxides and not necessarily the bare metal. I only leave each piece in for a few seconds and then remove them and wash them in water. After the acid dip, you can see that most of the paint is gone and what remains is easily removed. The metal has a gray haze to it, and to remove that I'll use a soft brass brush to clean it off and lightly polish the metal. Here's what the casting looked like after it was cleaned up. Nothing but pits everywhere. Wow, it actually looks interesting in this state. And before people start commenting that this was done by the acid, you'll see here in a little bit that the small metal base piece is just as pitted. This is just what the metal looks like after you remove all the oxidation. Looking at the small base piece, you can see that the word Ford in the grill is almost completely eaten away. I just cleaned up this piece with a wire brush because I want to look at fixing the small broken tab that holds the front axle. You could fix this any number of ways with glues and paint, but I'm going to actually replace the metal with metal. I'm putting the cart way in front of the horse here, as I almost have the video on soldering die cast done, so I'm not going to go over all the details here and instead give you a preview of the process. But the quick and dirty is that you have to copper plate the part to allow the solder to stick to the metal. Once the part is copper plated, you can use a regular soldering iron to heat the part up and then use regular solder to fill in the gaps and holes. As of right now, this is the only way I have found to weld or solder parts together, and that's not from a lack of trying other ways, including expensive brazing rods and fluxes. Once the solder is in place and is cooled, I can use needle files to file the solder down and shape it however I like to fix the gap in the metal. Of course, this leaves us with a copper-plated part, and that would look odd on the casting, so to turn it back to silver, I'll drop the part in the zinc plating bath for a few minutes to zinc plate over the copper metal. The voltage is set to about half a volt and 100 milliamps, just like I use for plating normal cars. The change from copper to zinc happens almost immediately, but I will leave the part in for about 15 minutes to build up a good plate on the part so I can then polish it. After the polishing, everything will blend together and you should not be able to notice that I've added the metal. Checking in real quick on the wheels and axles, they've been in the acid for about a day now, and one of the axles has dissolved away from the wheel, so I'll drop the other 3 back into the acid to continue its work for another day. While the axles continue to dissolve, I'll go ahead and paint the casting. I decided to use some of the enamel paints I bought from the Redline shop. These are color matched for certain Hot Wheels, but you can use them for other items if you like. This red turned out fine, but the yellow ended up being a bit too dark, despite it looking like a good match from the bottle. I washed the paint off in lacquer thinner and then repainted it with Tester's enamel yellow. That was a much closer match to the original paint. There are 4 versions of this truck. 2 of them have a light yellow bed and have different colored plastic pulls, and are far more common than the other 2 versions that have a more vibrant yellow with different colored plastic parts. The more vibrant yellow versions can go for much higher values, around $500 according to my price guide, so you can guess which one I went for. While I wait for the paint to cure, let's take a look at fixing the play feature of this toy. I decided to recreate the part instead of trying to fix the flimsy plastic. I found some sheet brass that was close to the thickness of the plastic. I placed the part over the brass and then scoured a line around it using an awl. Then using some scissors, I cut out the part, leaving some extra material on the end to make the handle, or whatever you want to call it. Once the part was cut out, I sanded it to both remove the burr and to get it to the correct size. Next, I need to work on creating the hole that allows the post to go through the part and also keeps it from being removed from the toy. Again, I placed the plastic part over the brass, being sure that I had the correct orientation, and then using the awl to scribe a line in the brass. With that done, I could turn to my Dremel and a barrel cutting tool to slowly remove material from the brass. You could always use a hand drill, but I find that cutting through thin metal to be a pain and rather dangerous. The Dremel always seems a lot better at cutting thin materials. After the hole is drilled, I'll test fit the part and make sure it is working as it should. The last thing I need to do is make the handle on the end. To do this, I'll first scribe a line where the bend needs to go. I'll then use a very specialized tool to make that bend. This is a miniature press brake, and it allows the user to make bends in thin sheet metals just like this brass. Now, this could be done with some pliers if you don't have one of these, but this device makes the process much easier and gives far better results. To use it, you load the part into it, placing the scored line on the pointed part of the press, and then tighten down the bolts, keeping an eye on the bend. You'll need to keep an eye on it as it can make a much shallower bend than 90 degrees. Once you have the bend you want, just loosen the bolts and remove the part. What is so great about one of these is that all the bending forces are being done at the bend. Unlike if you're using a pair of pliers where you would need to use the longer side as the lever to make the bend and risk bending it in the process. I picked this thing up at Micromart if you're interested in getting one. So right now you're probably asking yourself, isn't the fact that the part is brass colored going to be a problem and difficult to fix? Actually no, the fix is super easy, barely an inconvenience. I'll just zinc plate over the brass to turn the part silver. This will work out much better than painting it, as the paint would wear off from sliding against the body of the casting. Again, I'll leave the part in for several minutes to build up a nice zinc layer and then buff it with some 4/0 steel wool. So now I can shift over to the windshield, and at first glance it looks like it's in terrible shape with all that dirt and grime on it. The first thing I'll do is spend some time cleaning it with soap and water and a toothbrush, and then I'll polish it using some plastic polish and a buffing wheel. I'll show you the plastic polish later. After the polishing, I'll wash the part again with some soap and water to remove the polish and then check to see if there's any further defects. At this point I have 2 free wheels and 2 still on the acid. I've polished one of the wheels and need to polish the other. I've found this plastic polish from Meguiar's to be the best product for polishing plastic that I've come across. It works a lot better than the rubbing compound you've seen me use in previous videos. To use it, I apply a small amount to the part and then using the buffing wheel on my Dremel to buff the part to a nice shine. Since I have the front wheels polished and ready, I will go ahead and attach them to the new axle. Instead of brass rod that I normally use, I'm going to make it out of steel rod that I found from a company in Putnam, Connecticut. This is a high carbon steel that has not been hardened, so it's easy to mushroom the ends, but is a lot stronger than brass and more closely matches the original axles Lesney made. The process is easy, and I'm not going to show it all here as I have videos dedicated to it, but I'll cut the rod to length with the hacksaw and then mushroom one end. I'll then place one wheel on and then put the axle through the base and then through the other wheel. I'll then make a mark where the rod needs to be cut. After cutting the rod, I will once again thread all the parts through and then mushroom the cut end of the rod, keeping everything together. It ended up taking about 3 days for the acid to completely eat through the last 2 remaining wheels. But once they were done, I polished and then attached them to the axle and then the axle to the base. With that done, I could finally put the casting back together. I didn't mention it earlier, but I ended up doing 2 coats of paint on both parts of the body. This was to use the Mattel method of covering up imperfections. In other words, I used the paint as a filler for all the pits covering the casting. Of course, it's not a perfect solution, but it did go a long way to hiding all those pits. In the end, I was fairly happy with this restoration, especially given the condition it was in when I started. You may have noticed that I have tried a lot of new things on this casting, and that's because I was using it as a sort of guinea pig. Not that it was expendable per se, but because there was only so much I could do to get it back to its original condition. But for something that was buried for 35 to 40 years, I would say it looks pretty good. Of course, I'm always curious to know your thoughts on this and any car I restore, so let me know what you think below. I should have the soldering video out soon, with the next Mad Max video out in a week or so. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.